23rd Amity Special Board of Ed meeting at 6:03. We only have one item on our agenda tonight, and that's a question and answer session with the superintendent regarding the reopening of schools. So I know you all received the letter to the community today. Just a quick highlight of the fact that this is still a work in progress. It has been and it will continue to be, even after the date we formally submit to the state. There's continual information coming out regarding all different directives regarding safety, facilities, and the such. We are doing our best with everything, and this is a good chance now that that letter is out from Dr. Byers for us to spend some time and ask some questions and get a brief overview from Dr. Byers as far as how the plan is coming along and where we are today. One of the things I wanted to mention that we're looking to do to try to keep the lines of communication open and a little bit better than they have been, because now we're at the point where we can actually add to this plan. We can actually ask questions of the plan now that it's been fairly far along and fairly far formulated. Dr. Byers and I were thinking it might be a good idea, and we're certainly open to discussion on this, what your thoughts are of actually having a second monthly meeting, such that we would have the board meeting during the regular scheduled dates that are on our calendar, and then supplementing that with another meeting every 2 weeks. So we would have a meeting every 2 weeks, basically. So that's something we can talk about, but I think it's probably a good idea considering where we are right now. And I know that a number of you, and I'm sure a number of people in the community, want to hear from us and hear what's going on. So that's something we're most likely going to be doing. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Byers, and she will get us started on the evening.
So, well, thank you, Mr. Belfonte. So, first of all, to begin, thank you again for submitting the questions ahead of time. What I tried to do was, to the best of my ability, group questions in several of our subcommittee areas, because we have a lot of people working on many of these questions, and so it was sort of easier to kind of funnel them to the facilitators of those subcommittees. So you will see joining us on this call this evening are several of our district administrators who are the facilitators of those subcommittees. The other thing that I guess I will start the board with is kind of the same message I ended our group meeting with earlier today. And it's the idea of where we have the options for making decisions, and where in many of the cases the decisions are made for us already, and it's more our process of operationalizing those. So we are a teaching and learning organization, and our expertise rests in how we instruct students and the manner in which we do that. And when we talk about our subcommittees, half of them are related to the areas of teaching and learning. So that's the place where we can lend our knowledge and our experience and our expertise and our best recommendations. But the other 50% is in areas that are kind of outside of our knowledge base, but also to some degree outside of our control. So when we have a plan that comes down from the state that has requirements that you have to do, those are non-negotiables for us. And it's not a matter of whether in our personal opinions, we believe that it's right or wrong. It's not a matter of, hey, I watched this news program and they said this is something different and we need to try that because, I think that what they said was correct. We have an obligation to meet the requirements by the State Department of Education in submitting our plan. And in many of those cases, particularly the areas of health and wellness and facilities, we're guided by our health departments, because again, it's not we're an educational organization. We know how to teach kids and reach kids. We don't necessarily have the answers when it comes to some of those health and safety requirements. So we have been working very collaboratively throughout this process with our health departments which fortunately have the same medical advisor. So that kind of helps us out that QVHD, the Quinnipiac Valley Health District for Bethany and Woodbridge, has the same medical advisor as the Orange Public Health Department. But in many of the cases, the perception that there is somehow a level of choice in what we're doing is simply, it's a false perception. We have some requirements we have to meet, and we are doing that to the best of our possible abilities. And we're doing that in consultation with people who are really the experts in those areas. And so I think that has been a learning curve for all of us, because we've been accustomed to being pretty independent operators to some extent. And certainly when it comes to teaching and learning that we are. But we have learned that, and again, it's sort of the same thing that happened since March 13th when we all had to leave schools. We have been trying to become a little more attuned to the fact there are some things that are outside of our control, and we just have to figure out the best way to do that. To that end, we have had a reopening schools committee in place since June 30th, and it contains, it's a reopening committee of 54 people. So I often tell people that it's not a committee, it's an army. And we are all sort of joined together to make sure that we are operating in a way that is best possible. And those 54 individuals are subdivided into 10 subcommittees, who all then kind of funnel back to a planning and governance committee where we take their recommendations and their ideas. The interconnections are incredible. It's a domino effect, or if you are a parent and you have ever read the book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, and if you've ever read that, that is what we are living with, because every time we do one thing, something else happens. And so we are constantly trying to figure out how to adjust to that and how to cross-reference the recommendations that come from one committee. So that's kind of the paradigm that we are operating under. But we are, and that's where planning and governance comes into the mix, I guess, is that we look for those interconnections and try to pull the different pieces together so that we can see how individual decisions may affect additional decisions. So again, for tonight's meeting, what I did was take your questions. I tried to eliminate a lot of redundancies, of which there were. So that's kind of in some ways great, because it means that you're all thinking in the same ways. So I eliminated some redundancies, and then I tried to group those questions into the areas that our committees are working on to some extent, and address the topics that came up the most frequently. And then hopefully in the process of having conversations with some of the leaders of our groups, we will be able to answer most of those questions that you had. So I am going to jump right into that initially, and I'm going to start with one of those areas where honestly we have the sort of limited control, because we have some pretty strict guidance and a direction from both the state and from the health departments, and talk a little bit about facilities. You'll notice that Mr. Siza is not with us this evening, but he submitted a document that attempts to answer some of the primary questions that were asked. And so there are sort of 4 areas within facilities that seem to come up in the questions from the board. Those areas being issues of cleaning, of ventilation, of bathrooms, and then kind of the maximizing of the space that we have available to us. So we will just sort of start with the area of cleaning. And in that particular aspect, our custodians are going to be doing daily cleaning, as well as the additional cleaning of restrooms, cafeteria tables, and touch points, completely following the recommendations by the State Department of Education and the CDC. Additionally, we will be placing a sort of a bucket or a box of cleaning or disinfectant wipes in every single classroom, so that a teacher or a student would have access to the wipe to wipe a desk or a work surface during the school day. The recommendation from the state is that desks are cleaned once a day. So we are going above and beyond in that recommendation in providing access to these wipes so that students and or teachers would be able to access them. We still have to follow the state mandated green cleaning plan. So the idea of parents packing, Clorox wipes, which don't fall under that guideline, is not going to be able to be used. But what we select in terms of our product, we will make sure it falls within lines of the green cleaning. Disinfectants have always been exempt from that plan because there is no such thing as a green product that is also a disinfectant. So that is not something that we are able to use, and we will continue to adhere to the green cleaning. We will not be using any aerosols during the school day that would trigger any additional respiratory irritations. The disinfectant would be applied to the desks after school and would dissipate before the students return in the mornings. And we've been working for a product that we believe doesn't leave kind of like a residue or anything on the surfaces of the desks themselves. In terms of looking at ventilation, this has been something that we've been attuned to since the very beginning, because again, you are hearing the idea that outside is better than inside. We know from, again, the state guidance that opening windows is not one of the recommended practices because opening windows are going to trigger some other things such as allergens that people may be, have asthma to or have some sort of reaction to. But we have a very effective closed loop system that we are managing. We are able to sort of command the outside air dampers to any position that is recommended during the day. We don't have poor ventilation. We monitor our air ventilation systems, and we would make changes to those systems as recommended by either the CDC, the local health departments, or any of the other medical advisors that we're working with. Our filters are going to be changed in August, which is our usual practice. But after consultation with the QVHD, maintaining our HVAC systems within sort of their closed structures with the proper filtering is actually one of the best things that we can do to help our air systems. These were questions we actually submitted probably back when schools were closed to make sure that we were doing the proper procedures for the people who were in the building. And our health department said, no, if your filters are in the right place and you are monitoring it, then that is the safest thing that you can do when you think of sort of, again, kind of the global picture of what happens when you open windows and let things into the building versus when you have things that are in the building and your filters are filtering them out. Restrooms, we have within the State Department guidelines some extremely explicit protocols with respect to restrooms. Most of our restrooms right now are sort of touch-free. So flushing and sink faucets are already touch-free, and we will make sure that all of those batteries are replaced so that they are in working order before school opens. We are ordering soap dispensers, but they are not, so that we have some additional soap dispensers. They are not touch-free because we simply, the supply is not available to us. But to make sure we're encouraging the hand washing, we're making sure that we have enough soap dispensers into those bathrooms. We cannot use automatic hand dryers. That's one of the recommendations that we have to move away from. So instead, we have to go back to paper towels, but we are ordering some touch-free paper towel dispensers to replace those hand dryers. Bathrooms will be open, and we are going to look at one of the areas where we may have to hire some additional staff, our staff to monitor the bathrooms. not so much the activity that's happening inside of those bathrooms, but just the number of individuals who are in those spaces at a time. Additionally, throughout the classrooms, and again, this doesn't really have a connection with the restrooms, but when we talk about the hand washing, in addition to making sure that we are providing more resources for students to be able to wash their hands, every one of our classrooms will be equipped with a hand sanitizer that's inside of it. And pretty much as students walk through the door, they would be able to use the hand sanitizer as they come in. Again, we're looking, we have several of those ordered. We're ordering more of those, but that's going to be one of those things that will be an additional cost that we have to manage at some point. In terms of repurposing space, we're doing several things in that area. The first thing that we are really trying to do is look at the classrooms themselves. And again, the CSDE guidelines are very explicit in this area. They say that when you can maintain 6-foot social distancing, that is optimal, but you do it to the best of your ability. Because they're recognizing that school districts and school buildings, first of all, they're all different ages and they're structured totally differently when you consider the state of Connecticut, but that it's also not always 100% possible to maintain that 6-foot distancing. So they are giving some flexibility there. Our medical advisor with the Orange Health Department and the QVHD has actually sanctioned a 3 to 6 foot spacing is what we need to aim for, with obviously it being optimal that the farther apart we put kids, the better that it is. So a couple of the things that we are looking to do to kind of increase that spacing is first going into the classrooms and removing extraneous furniture that doesn't need to be there, so that way we can maximize the space that actually occurs between the desks or where the students are sitting. The second thing that we are doing is we are obviously looking at our enrollment per class and per space, so that we can look for opportunities where we can either move kids' schedules around so that we are able to put students in less crowded classes, moving them from more crowded classes. Or if we have a particularly crowded class, looking for an alternate location where that class might be able to be conducted. So that we are able to spread students apart there. I know one of the recommendations that keeps seeming to come out from the State Department of Education is to use gymnasiums and auditoriums. Regretfully, those are instructional spaces for us, and the ability to shift classes into our teaching spaces for our health and PE teachers, or for many of our instrumental or vocal performance teachers, that's not actually possible. We need those for teaching. So while we've considered that, we've also been cognizant to the fact that we also need teaching spaces for some of these classes. And then the last thing that we are looking at is, when all else fails, are there opportunities where we can take a particularly large class and essentially split it in half? And in doing so, we would be asking teachers to pick up an additional class, which we have provisions for within the existing teacher contract. It does come with a cost to the district. And I think at the last count, when we went through the high school schedule in particular, there were 60 classes that seemed to have a class enrollment that exceeded the number of students that we believed would fit into those classrooms. So we are really kind of focusing on those classes and ways in which we can hopefully mitigate those class size enrollments. I will be bluntly honest that right now our biggest challenge is lunch, and it's lunch at the high school. We have been working with the health district to try to look at different options and opportunities for us, and how we might possibly manage to conduct lunch. And that is one of our major outstanding questions that we still do not have resolution for. I will say that we are mandated by the federal government to provide lunch for students. So not having that as an option, or saying that we're just not going to serve kids lunch, that's just not possible. We just have to figure out the way to do it in a manner that's the most safe. And obviously lunch is one of those kind of additional issues because the only way to eat lunch is to remove your mask. So it's kind of like a twofold challenge for us, in that we have to address a space issue, but it's a space issue that's a little more problematic than when students are actually able to wear their masks. So that essentially encompasses some of the work that the facilities committee has been working on. Again, I will stress that the state has given very, very specific guidelines around cleaning, what's cleaned, how often, what we're able to use, what we can't use. And so we are going to adhere to that, and we are following those recommendations and protocols. One of the things that we have paid some consideration to with respect to our scheduling of custodial staff is making some shifts. So the people that, we tend to be heavily weighted towards evening custodial support because, the kids are out of the building and we just kind of go through and clean the building right then and there. We will be shifting most likely more people to the daytime so that we are able to maintain cleaning of touch points, cleaning of the restrooms, cleaning of the cafeteria spaces. And we are also looking at probably more consistently using our substitute custodians, not as substitutes, but as regular cleaning staff so that we have enough people sort of on hand to be able to provide the cleaning that is required. So hopefully those facilities questions, most of those that came out were answered. And if you do have any additional questions following the meeting, if you want to email those to me, I will forward those to Mr. Siza so that he can address those specifically. And obviously he regrets not being able to spend the evening here with all of you. So with that, I'm actually going to move on to the second kind of big topic, which was, it's what we're calling physical wellness, but it's kind of the area that encompasses nursing and our response to people who are ill, as well as our plans for how we manage some of these things. And again, these are very, very specific guidelines that we will follow according to the State Department of Education, as well as the Department of Public Health and our local health districts. And I am going to let Mr. Brandt, who is going to be our contact person for he is the person who is going to be responsible for making sure that we are in compliance. So he is our COVID compliance officer for the district. So I will let him take it away and hopefully address some of the questions and concerns that came up in that area.
Thank you, Dr. Byers. So as Dr. Byers has said, with our physical health and wellness, we're a subcommittee that has grown over time to include the acting health department director from Quinnipiac, the consulting physician to both the Quinnipiac and Orange Health departments, and also our district medical advisor. And in addition to our district nursing supervisor, school nurses, we also have a subcommittee off of ours that uses our information to help guide athletics. So some of the concerns in reviewing the questions, some of the areas that we're looking at were the health and safety compliance liaison. So as Dr. Byers had indicated, that will fall underneath my auspices, which then will allow me to go and figure out who's the most appropriate person to gather the information from or to refer the person to while supporting Dr. Byers in that process. But I'll be the primary contact for concerns related to the COVID liaison position. A big focus was contact tracing, and something that we've talked about a lot in our subcommittee meetings and then had separate conversations with the health department and our district medical advisor. And it's really something the state has really identified as spread mitigation. So how do we go about reducing the spread should something happen? Contact tracing, the district has two different platforms that we'll be able to utilize within the district through the support of Mr. DeRosa and the technology department. One is our nursing software platform that's known as Snap. That has recently added features that allow for contact tracing. And then also within our student management system, PowerSchool, that will allow us to, they have additional add-ons that have been added to the system to allow us to support that. Ultimately, the information we receive, we will then be sharing to the health department, because ultimately the health department will be our liaison and our support for all contact tracing and spread mitigation. They ultimately are responsible for and continue to be responsible for monitoring the community outbreaks by their districts and their areas that they serve. As we're working with the health department, we're realizing that, as Dr. Beyer said, some of this information changes. So oftentimes the information that we get from Dr. Germain or our district advisor, we're using that in conjunction with the health department information to make the best choice that follows the CSDE guidelines. So it's the blending of the information that we receive. Some questions also regarding COVID exposure, the plan for students and staff. So when this happens, our first phone call is going to be to the local health department. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, so I do apologize. But that will be our first phone call to get their advisement based on that specific case. And that's something to remember, that each possible COVID exposure, COVID positive, whatever it may be, is going to have specific details that are unique to that specific case that then we will share with the health department, and then they will use that specific information to advise us on our next steps. That is the most important thing to remember. Not all COVID cases are the same, because you have to, as questioned, there may be other considerations involved, including when it happened, where it happened, is it COVID symptomology, is it an actually positive COVID test, and whatnot. Additionally, there were questions around what are the triggers to the 3 modes of learning. So we know that we've been asked as a district to submit a full return to school, a hybrid return to school, and a distance learning plan, in addition to a fourth plan regarding students who stay at home. The triggers for those aren't determined at the local level. Those decisions are going to be made on information that's shared with the health department regarding our local community spread and/or directives from the CSDE if it's a larger outbreak. Certainly Dr. Byers will have a say in that, but we will be receiving our information regarding our own community spread. So for us, that's communities, Orange, Bethany, and Woodbridge. And that will help us determine when we need to move into a different plan. There has been talk out there consistently that at some point, and it may still be coming, that there will be additional information from the state forthcoming about what will lead you from one level, I suppose, to the next level. But to the best of my knowledge, as of today, we have not received that specific guidance. Other questions, and one of the hot button questions and something we've spent a lot of time on, is masks. Do we have to provide masks? How will we enforce mask wearing? How do we support students in that process? We are encouraging all students and requiring students to bring their masks. However, we will be providing masks to students who do not come with their own masks. Additionally, we are encouraging staff to bring masks, but we'll also be providing masks. The types of masks we are still looking into. We're doing some research along with a couple of the other subcommittees. So to Dr. Byers' point, with this one, it falls over into instructional operations a little bit to identify the best masks to use, not only from a medical and safety side, but also from a curricular instructional side, whether that may be clear masks or allowing our speech language pathologists to provide their services. But we will be providing masks and requiring their use. One of the follow-up questions within that is, what do we do for students who refuse to wear their masks? And that is something that's going to be an ever evolving and ongoing situation. Certainly there's going to be a hierarchy or a framework of reminders and support based on why they aren't wearing their mask. Ultimately, that decision has not been made exactly what that will look like, because we're trying to balance health and safety while not excluding students from their education. So we don't have a direct answer for that yet, as we're still waiting for some additional support and guidance from the CSDE regarding that. They will be absolutely required to wear their masks, but how we deal with individual students will vary based on their situation for why they're not wearing their mask. Additional questions was about, how do we enforce the hand washing? How do we make sure students are engaging in those good hygiene practices? First and foremost, coming out of the physical well-being subcommittee is professional development that we need to provide not only to staff, but so that the staff then can provide that down to their students. So the physical well-being committee is designing some of their own professional development, but also using resources from the CDC. And within that, we have to include professional development for staff regarding good hygiene, PPE, appropriate use of PPE. So how do we wear a mask appropriately? Social distancing, signs of symptoms of COVID-19, and then additionally, how also to clean our masks. There are certain ways and CDC approved ways to clean the reusable masks and a frequency that they need to be cleaned within. So the committee will then make recommendations for that professional development, design that professional development, share it with the teachers, and then that will then get pushed down to the students to help them make sure that they're engaging in those good hand washing techniques. Additionally, questions were housed around what do we do with what if they show the signs and symptoms? So the state has been very clear about the need for an isolation room for students and or staff who are showing signs and symptoms of COVID-19. So we will be using the CDC signs and symptoms. So the official signs and symptoms off the CDC website. Those students will be brought to our school nursing offices or staff. They'll be evaluated. If they meet those signs and symptoms, they will be put into an isolation space. Our district nursing supervisor has been working closely with the state and our local health department to determine exactly what that space needs to look like. Then the parents will be asked to come and pick them up. In terms of what their return to school will look like, that is going to probably depend on where we are in September when we return to school based on the latest guidance of what that return needs to look like. So when the students go home, depending on their signs and symptoms, and we will be telling them they need to follow up with their medical professional, because that is what the current expectation would be, is that they would need to follow up with their medical professional and then provide us that information about what the medical professional recommend. However, as Dr. Beyer said, that may change between now and when we start school, but our return to school, if you are sent home because of symptoms that we believe are consistent with COVID-19, will follow whatever the CDC or CSDE guidelines are at the time. There were additional questions regarding will schools require regular testing from staff and students? That is not being recommended at this time. That is not a recommendation of the State Department or our health department or the state health department regarding regularly testing our staff or our students. We will have procedures and protocols in place to help us monitor staff or students who might be presenting with symptoms, but we, at this time, based on the recommendations we have, will not be requiring regular testing from our staff or our students. I said a lot. It covered a lot of the topics. I hope that answered all the questions. It's ever evolving. Please know we are consistently working with the health department. Allie at Quinnipiac Valley Health gets quite a few phone calls from us on a daily basis sometimes to recheck the information she has. But after this meeting, as Dr. Beyer said, if you have additional questions or something comes up, please feel free to submit that to Dr. Byers, and then she'll certainly get it to me to clarify through our subcommittee.
And I just really want to reemphasize one of the points that I think was literally in every single one of your sets of questions, which was, actually there were two. What happens when there's a positive case? And how do we know to flow from the three models of either we're going to be in person, hybrid, or remote? Every positive case will be treated individually, and it will be in conjunction with the health department. There is no protocol out there in terms of what happens when there's a positive case. We do have sort of a basic outline that we actually developed back in March of what happened with positive cases with staff that we shared with QVHD, who's used that as a model, but it's just it's a guidance document. It's not this is what happens every single time, because it is contingent on the case itself. The other aspect is that fluidity between those 3 different types of learning plans. The state has said that they would provide us with some additional information on how to help us with guidance in those areas. That is one of the outstanding questions that we still do not have any information on. And that is one of those things that we are going to continue to wait in our plan development until we have that additional information, because we have no sense of how we flow between those models. We're supposed to have those 3 models, but there is absolutely no guidance at this time for what triggers which one. And so those are 2 fairly significant areas that I think are going to continue. Particularly how you handle individual COVID cases will be unknown. It will be something that happens on that case-by-case basis, but until we have guidance with those 3 models, that's one of those reasons why we're not quite ready with presenting our plan, because we really don't have a good answer to that. I think that kind of summarizes, again, most of what came through most clearly in terms of our, in terms of the questions. I know those questions about the high-risk students and staff. Again, we will follow CDC recommendations, because if you pay attention to any of this, it changes and updates on an almost daily basis. So who qualifies as high risk, we're going to follow at the point in time that we are operating, because the lists grow and fluctuate literally week to week. So with that, I'm going to ask that we transition from physical wellness to kind of that mental health and social emotional wellness. And I am going to, let's see, ask if Dr. Tracy doesn't mind to chime in, but also I'll have Mr. Brandt continue to participate as well.
So I'll begin as I think Dr. Tracy, oh, here he is. Go ahead, Dr.
He's parking his car, apparently. Hey, Dr. Tracy.
How are you? Yeah, right as you said my name, everything cut out. Awesome.
All right. Do you want to give some updates? I know you're school culture and climate, but I know that it overlaps tremendously with social emotional wellness. And between you and Mr. Brandt, I believe we can probably accomplish what we need to address in the area of that social emotional wellness.
Absolutely. So we've been doing a lot of work, and like Dr. Byers has said, our committee does cross over a lot with social and emotional wellness, and I'm on that committee also. So some of the things that, to address the questions that were asked directly, it talked a little bit about what is the plan to address the students' social and emotional wellness, and it's what it was prior to us going out on COVID, and during COVID, students will have advisory, and the advisory is the main vehicle that we use to address social and emotional wellness. So we'll continue to have that whether we're in person or whether we're distance learning. In addition to that, both groups have been working on tip sheets and handouts for teachers that they could use in class as ways to kind of address social and emotional learning in their classes, as well as a template that we've put together for teachers to use as they plan lessons to intentionally incorporate and embed social and emotional learning, not just into the lesson body, but into the introduction of the lesson and the closure of the lesson, to make sure that they're having a constant eye on it. And that'll be a little bit more when we get into the curriculum part about how they'll do that and how they're going to document that. But we have a way for the teachers to intentionally embed social emotional learning into their lessons. I don't know what else I might be missing. Mr. Brandt, are you?
Sure thing. So additionally, on the Mental Health and Wellness Committee, we've also talked about The committee has developed several forms to help us identify those students who are having trouble engaging even in either in the hybrid model or in the pure distance learning model, and additionally engaging students who are having trouble returning to school from the long layoff. So we've created universal forms that we can use across all 3 buildings that will allow teachers and support staff to identify what we'd call students at risk, and then be able to provide appropriate mental health supports to them. Additionally, within it, the questions, will we have provisions to support? I do apologize. My 4-year-old is having a meltdown in the background right now. How are we going to help students families who elect to stay home, but require, Mia, go see your mother, please. How are we going to support students who choose to come stay home, but may have mental health concerns or engagement concerns while schools are in session? So between our support staff, we will continue to reach out to those students using some of the similar telehealth supports that we use during the current time frame. Additionally, the social emotional committee is also working on various forms of professional development that will be shared out with staff, because staff well-being is essential throughout this whole process. We know we need to support our teachers. So we'll be working on stuff such as mindfulness, self-regulation that can be provided to them, in addition to providing additional supports that individual staff members may need throughout this process, and helping them return back to the schools after the layoff. I believe
one of the other questions that was asked was how the survey is going to change to the parents. And obviously, we learned a lot from the first survey, and the second survey that we put out to the parents when the plan is released will be in much more detail, and hopefully twofold. It'll address some of the concerns that were raised in the kind of the qualitative data that was collected in the survey. And we've also used that qualitative data, that parents' concerns. There was a general concern about wearing masks and cohorting and distancing. And we'll definitely address those issues, not just in the plan. So we've incorporated some of the data into how we're going to roll the plan out. But then when we ask the questions will be informed by the survey that we released earlier, and be in much more detail than just, are you sending them or not?
So one of the, a couple of things, just again to cycle back around, both of these groups, whether it's the school culture and climate or the social emotional wellness, again, because there's a lot of overlap, they've been very cognizant of being aware, particularly of the kids at those transition years. So the incoming 7th graders and the incoming 9th graders, because we have a tremendous amount of data on our existing students, but the kind of new kids are the ones that we tend to know the least. So I know that counselors at the middle schools have already been in contact with the elementary schools to identify those kids who in 6th grade were not engaged in the distance learning. So that way, as they come into us in 7th grade, it's not a surprise for us, and we have some strategies and have some people that we know that we need to reach out to right away. And by a similar token, our middle school counselors will be in contact with the high school counselors to make sure that those 8th graders who are transitioning to 9th grade, who also had some difficulties engaging, they are identified early on, so that again, it's not a surprise, but it's something that everybody is aware of and knows.
And some of those meetings have already occurred. I know that the counselors in the middle schools have already spoken with the high school counselors. And for example, today, one of the middle school counselors was in and was calling some of the parents of students that come in with 504 or IEPs. So they were making those outreaches just today.
And that second survey, again, it's not developed yet. It's going to be a combination of what we know we need to know in terms of far more detail. So I'm going to use transportation as an example. We asked a very general question. Are you going to send your kids to school on the bus or not? And, we got some responses back. We need to know more. We need to know, are you going to send them in the morning? Are you going to send them in the afternoon? What happens if it's a delay day? What happens if it's an early release? Then are you going to use the transportation? By the way, did you ever send them on transportation before and now you're changing? Or did you always just bring your kids in and this is no different for you? So we know we have to get to nuances of that, but we weren't able to go there yet because we had to sort of figure out what we realized we have to put a plan out before people are able to answer that level of detail of question, but we couldn't put a plan out without having some sense of what people were thinking. So we envision that second survey as really eliciting far more detail that will help us in our planning as we go forward. And, you know, to Dr. Tracy's point, we had a lot of places where people could just kind of say, what other concerns do you have? And we would be able to craft those survey questions to hopefully address those concerns, or in the process of crafting the plan, hopefully we're able to address some of those concerns that came up. But that's what we're envisioning for that second survey, is making sure that as opposed to just kind of this broad sweeping generalization, we have a much better sense. The other thing is if anybody was a parent and took the survey the first time, we didn't track who the parent was or who the kid was. But going through the second time, we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to know if a parent is intending to keep their child at home. We need to know the name of that kid and that you're intending to do that, because that has impact on our class enrollments and our sizes. So it will be a much more comprehensive, detailed survey. But we felt that that was better to be done later in the summer, closer to when school's going to start, because if anybody knows anything, this situation evolves on a daily basis, and what's happening right now is not what it's going to look like 2 weeks from now, and certainly not what it may look like on August 31st when our students return to school. So we realize we have to walk kind of a delicate path between getting information in a timely fashion, but also getting information that is most reflective of the feelings and the perceptions of our community as we approach the start of the school year. So I'm going to turn it over to the big ticket item, which is Mrs. Loomis, and questions around finances. Which that I think was after the wellness was the second biggest question that seemed to come up from our board members was what happened, like how do we pay for all this and what is the difference going to be? So I'm going to let Terry have some airtime here.
Good evening. I don't think it'll come as a surprise from everything you've heard so far that the impact of the budget will be significant. We are tracking expenses. We are trying to project expenses going forward based on these plans. It is difficult to project a lot, as Dr. Byers and most committee people have referred to. The plan keeps changing. So we're doing our best to try to get a good projection of that. We have, for the fiscal year 21, identified new account codes directly related to COVID so that we can put those expenses in those accounts once they are known, and we can easily identify them. That is for many reasons. And one is, should there be any federal funds, state funds available for reimbursement, we want to be able to easily pull that information together and apply for those funds. So right now, we probably spent a little over $400,000 at the end of last year to purchase PPE, the thermal cameras, the laptops for teachers. So all of those we are currently have in our list of purchases that if they become eligible, we will certainly try to get some kind of grant funding for, but they're currently now out of the fiscal year 20 budget. When we look at the current year budget, the fiscal year 21 budget, it's probably a little over $2 million that we are estimating. And a lot of that has to do with what we could incur in staffing cost. So such things as we anticipate we will need more staff. So whether that is custodial staff, in addition, as Dr. Byers suggested, the substitute custodians, substitute teachers. Substitute teachers are already in high demand. Every district is facing what we're facing. So we are anticipating that we are going to have to adjust that rate of pay in order to make Amity the attractive place to be and get some qualified subs into the district and at a much higher volume than we have in the past, both due to, staff's availability, potential illnesses, and such. You heard talk of the isolation room. We are trying to get guidance about how that isolation room will be staffed. Will we need additional nursing staff to help supervise that room? That opinion seems to change, a lot, but we're anticipating that we might. So that's one of the things we're thinking about. Well, we're looking at pods to store some of that furniture that Dr. Byers talked about that we might need to move out of the classroom. Jim Seiss is looking at the best container that is going to store the stuff well. So, and how many we would need and such. Then there's signage for the buildings that we would need to put in place to remind people of social distancing, wearing their masks, especially when you're coming into the cafeteria. Some things we will use simple duct tape on the floor. We will certainly try to be, cost effective in some of this, but some things need to have that standard sign that people see, keep your mask on, keep your distance. But, floor markings might be a little bit more simplified. But that's also going to take time by the staff to put in. So there is a significant amount that will be in the staffing area. So that being said, that is, bringing back all the model of bringing back all the students and probably needing the most coverage in classrooms is probably the most expensive. Where are we going to possibly get these funds? We did, as you remember, I told you back in June that we were going to encumber 15% of accounts that we considered, I hate the word discretionary, but they weren't contractual accounts. So that total is $968,000 that we are holding aside. So that gives us a start to fund some of these costs. As I said, we're tracking the costs. So should we be able to claim any on FEMA, we will. My intention is always to ask for everything. You can tell me I can't have it, but I will ask for everything. We can't ask for the FEMA funds until we spend our ESSER funds. So we are on track to do that probably early to end of August. That is a small amount of money. It's $55,000. So that application, we have to make a tweak to it and we'll be finalizing that shortly. But that is, that it will not take us long to meet that threshold and then move on to ask for FEMA funds. So we've already started the FEMA application, we've registered. It's just a matter of the timing to start, applying for some of those funds. It will, it may, depending on how things go, what our reopening really does look like, how long we go full speed as to how much of these costs fully pan out. This is estimating for a year's worth. So we will see how that goes. So there was another question about how does quarantine impact staff sick time and leave? So we will be following, the federal guidelines, state guidelines, and the bargaining unit contracts as to that. So initially, staff will have 80 hours of COVID absolute leave if they have certain instances, whether they are getting tested positive, whether they have been in contact with someone who has close contact with someone who has tested positive. There's a number of criteria that would trigger that event. So that is available to them one time until December 31st, as provided now by the regulations. After that, they can apply for FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, and take unpaid time off. If they are staff that have vacation time, personal time accrued, and they need to quarantine and they've already gone a second time or they've already had multiple incidences, they can use their own time that is available to them. If they have exhausted all of that time, they would be on paid time, but their leave would be protected. It is really hard to judge how many people will utilize that. There could be staff members who, have events that will trigger FEMLA and could be out for 12 weeks. That obviously, depending on their position, whether if it's a teaching staff, obviously that's right away that hits the substitute cost. Depending on other positions, can we live without that position or that person in their job for that time period, or can we get part-time sub coverage? It's all going to depend on the role the person has. So I know that was a big number to drop, but it is a daunting environment at this point. But we are, putting plans in place to try to meet every challenge that there is out there financially to do what is required of us.
And I would emphasize, we have said to the board since probably May, and I know we certainly emphasized it in our June meeting, that the 1% that we are allowed to kind of reclaim from the prior year budget was going to be critical to our ability to stay afloat in the 2021 school year. And I imagine that, I know that the towns are going to be facing many of these same challenges, and the town school districts are going to be facing all the exact identical challenges that we are facing. So I recognize that there is going to be pressure on the board to return all of the money to the towns so that they can stay afloat. But I'm going to, sort of urge you to remember your commitment is to the students in the community of Amity. And that 1% is going to be critical to helping us stay afloat and to be able to mitigate our costs. So at the point in time when we get to have this discussion starting in August and September, it is a very significant and serious situation that we're facing in terms of finances. And I understand that sort of push and pull you're going to feel between representing the towns and representing our school district. But it is really something that we are quite honestly counting on, that we would have support from the community and from the board, because we really do not know how else to make ends meet without that as an additional way of helping us out. The idea that there is funding out there that we can somehow, get a hold of. The CARES Act funding was the funding, and we received $55,000. That is hardly a dent in the things that we need to be able to do to sort of move our district forward with the requirements that we have to have. So yes, it's serious and significant. The other thing that's an interesting challenge is that just like the springtime, as the situation changes, we are probably going to have some savings in areas that we don't know of yet, because we don't know what's been canceled because of the situation we're in. So we also kind of acknowledge, like, there is a give and take going on right now that we have very little ability to sort of wrap our heads around in a definitive manner. We can estimate costs, but that ability to be able to actually have a firm, solid handle on things is going to remain a little murky for a while, until we know kind of what the reopening plans are like and what expectations are in certain areas where we've been able to find funding before. So if anything, that's going to be an ongoing, and it's like, it's not even a week by week process. I will say Terry and I incurred the cost for those isolation rooms, and 18 hours later we had a different answer, and all of a sudden we didn't need $56,000. And that's how quickly it changes in the course of hours, not in the course of weeks, not in the course of months, but literally hours. We're changing our predictions. So that's just kind of the reality of it, and we laugh a lot and we smile a lot, but the idea that there's some ability to predict this with any sort of assurance, right now, we are not in that position. But what I will say is that we are operating with kind of a level of caution, because again, we recognize that as a regional school district, we have sort of a different circumstance than, say, town districts do in appropriating additional monies. So that's going to be an ongoing challenge. The questions around staffing and leave and quarantine, Right now, we are operating under the guidelines that have been provided to us by the federal government. They've put some measures in place to really help address that. But I think in many cases, and I know this was a question that came up several times, and we'll address it sort of in my other where things didn't quite fit. There are a lot of aspects of what we still have to do that are going to be part of collective bargaining agreements. And there's a significant amount of work that has to be done there. So, so there will be several questions that we can't really provide you an answer with tonight, in part because it has to be negotiated, and because it's perhaps subject to negotiations, we don't want to destroy our position in that by sort of saying something that we still have to have some discussion over. So right now we are operating within the auspices mostly of the EPSLA, the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, FEMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, as well as the Extended Family Medical Leave Act, and then also ADA and Americans with Disabilities Act. Those are the things that guide us right now. But again, I would caution that there's still much further discussion to be had in those areas. So with that happy news about the fact we really can't predict our money, I'm actually going to turn it to the one thing, the one area where we do have some expertise. And that's in the area of teaching and learning. And again, there were a lot of questions that came up in this area. So that you know, again, sort of talking about our Reopening Schools Committee, we're made up of 54 people. Those 54 people are including teachers and administrators and students, including our two student board reps, Carolyn and Allie, who are on this conversation tonight. We have nurses, we have custodians. When we need to bring them on board, we bring on the bus drivers, we bring on food service people. And so we have a lot of people on this committee, but half of that committee, 50% of our committees are in the areas of teaching and learning, because it's the place where we are able to best provide some guidance. So those committees in teaching and learning are subdivided into 5 committees: instructional operations, curriculum, assessment, digital learning / offsite pedagogy, and then the school culture and climate. We've already heard a little bit from the school culture and climate, but I'm going to sort of let the group weigh in. And so this might be a little more lively conversation because Ms. Mann, Dr. Tracy, Mrs. Burke, Mr. Brandt, Dr. McPadden, and myself can all be able to chime in, as well as Allie and Carolyn, to sort of talk about what we're looking at. Again, there were several questions that came up in this area, and so we'll just kind of go through sort of the big ones that were most common. And the first one of those being, I think, a discussion around, I'm sorry, I'm switching back and forth between some files here, but it was the discussion around cohorting. So does anybody want to talk a little bit about that and how it's going to look at the middle school potentially, and then how it may look different at the high school? Mrs. Burke, I see you unmuted, so I'll let you start.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. So in terms of cohorting at the middle school level, we went through various scenarios, and what we decided would be best practice would be to group students by their math classes. And so the students would be in their math classes, and then for the rest of the day, they would remain in the same classroom and teachers would cycle through. This would limit interaction to a maximum of 20 students in the room. And also, in addition to that, as we cohort students, we're actually altering the schedule for the day to limit the traffic within the hallway as well. So we really are trying, by cohorting, the hope is to keep it down to the smallest group possible, which would be at max 20 students.
And if I remember correctly, even within those cohorts, we will assign the the life arts teachers to a particular cohort so that they would cycle through just that one particular life arts at that time. And we would, the lunch waves would be organized by those cohorts of kids. And we would be able to, I think that the places where we had the flexibility where they sort of uncohorted was mostly in health and PE. And the lunchroom would obviously be a bigger group of kids, but they would still be somewhat organized by their cohort of students. Is that correct, Mrs. Burke or Dr. Tracy?
Correct. We don't anticipate more than one team of students. Our cafeteria typically holds 200, and we don't anticipate more than the 90 students within the room. And between that and the outdoor seating, we're confident that we can maintain an appropriate space. In addition to that, we can also utilize the large group instruction room as well, and use other spaces so that students always maintain that safe distance apart during lunch. And I don't want to get into the food service part, but that's also been addressed.
In Bethany, it's a little different. There's 2 cafeterias, so we're able to break them up a little bit differently. And we're going to schedule our lunches by team. So teams consist of about 90 students, split into two cafeterias. And then, like Kathy said, we have some outdoor space while we do. And then we'll consider repurposing some area, maybe half of the gymnasium or the stage area or something like that, to use some of the outdoor seating indoors if we need further distance. But I think that separating kids, by team, lunch by team, will give us more than enough distance. But we have a person from the QHVD coming in on next Tuesday, I believe, to give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the plan that we have right now for lunch. In addition to this cohorting idea too, it's important to note that students will mix by team in class, PE class, and music and Chinese class. That's the only time that students are going to have to leave their room that they're in and go to a different room, because we can't do band in a classroom. Band has to happen in the band room, and PE has to happen in the gymnasium. So those are a couple times where students, but we're still going to narrow it down to just having kids on the same team be in those classes together. It's just important to note that that's when they do come out of the tighter cohort.
And in conversations with the medical advisor for the Orange Health Department in QVHD, Dr. Mohammed, he really emphasized that the greatest extent that we could cohort students for as many grades as we possibly could, that was one of the best things that we could do in terms of helping with, really it's more the contact tracing and the spread. So there was and again, I'm just sort of giving background, there was a point in time where we sort of considered our teams as cohorts and not kind of like just the individual class. And after speaking with Dr. Mohammed, when we realized that we really could look at it on a class level, that was more consistent with the recommendations that he was making. I will be very clear that we have in the past had levels for all of our classes, whether it's English or social studies or science. We've always had the advanced and the comp level. Those can't exist when we cohort kids because our kids are going to be a mixed group of kids who are going to be in a group together because of the math class that they're taking. And so that is the trade-off that we are having to make. But when we looked at the recommendations from the health department versus what we were able to do, that was one of those things that we felt we would own and take that on so that we would be able to at least provide additional cohorting. So I will let Ms. Mann talk a little bit about the high school, which I'm going to say right up front, and we've been really bluntly honest with everybody. Cohorting at the high school and maintaining a high school is simply not possible. But I will let you, Mrs. Mann, talk about that a little bit.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you so much. And I've been listening all, for the last hour or so, and I just want to echo a few things that Dr. Byers has said and a couple other of my colleagues have said just about, our kind of we usually, our Amity Army is usually our group of fans that come to our various athletic events, but we truly have kind of compiled a group of educators and students who are super dedicated to our community. And so I just want to, I'm proud of that. Even though we are constrained by a lot of the expectations of the state, so there's not as much choice as we would like to have. So the conversations tend to sometimes be a little bit more kind of brainstorming and philosophical. And when we get down to brass tacks, we have to just kind of abide by the guidelines. But I really appreciate the amount of time that our two students who are here have put in this summer, along with their classmates, and as well as the faculty and my colleagues, the other administrators. It's just kind of, that's something we really pride ourselves on at Amity, is trying to hear from all voices. So even if we can't do everything that all the voices are saying, we appreciate hearing from them. I'm actually in the middle of a residency week with my UB classes this week, and I was talking with one of my classmates, and she likened all of the work that we've been doing to an educational escape room exercise. Every time we unlock one thing, we see there are 15 other locks that have just presented themselves to us, or puzzles or problems. And I thought that was a very appropriate way to look at this, that everything that we come up with, there are a lot of dead ends. And so we are really trying to navigate through, and nobody's found their way through. So, if you're hearing that there's this plan or that plan, and this is the kind of gold standard, I hope that everybody understands that nobody has the right answers yet. So we're all working diligently to try to come up with the best answers for the situation at hand. This is a scary time. It's a scary time. It's an unsettling time for everybody. It's unsettling for educators and for students and for parents. So we just need to acknowledge that as we go through this work, there are things that we're trying to maintain school in some semblance, especially at the high school level, and about the cohorts, as to what school should look like. And so now kind of moving into the concept of cohorting at the high school, if we were to try to cohort kids, similar to how the middle school is doing, for example, that would mean absolutely no electives, because we cannot offer the electives to kids if we just did everybody by their math class. So it doesn't work at the high school. We have 1,463 kids who are members of our school community. So what we have worked with is to try to really look at the physical spaces within our classrooms. And there's a lot more. We are very lucky in that we have a lot more space within our classrooms. Certainly now at 1,450 or 60 kids versus 10 or 12 years ago when we had 1,650. So I'm thankful that we don't have overcrowding issues. And we have a beautiful building. We've got wonderful HVAC. So we can take advantage and be creative with the use of space and the way that we ask kids to move through that space. And so while we will not be cohorting students, we will be looking at a lot of alternatives for lunch, a lot of different places to set up space for lunch. We did have John Ladano as our sanitarian, who also is part of our Tools for Schools committee, come and do a walkthrough with us. And he gave us a lot of good feedback. And that, coupled with Dr. Muhammad's feedback, has been really helpful, but it presented a whole bunch more locks for us. So we just have to work to figure out how to get the answers to those puzzles. So that's kind of where we stand.
So a second major question that kept coming up was the hybrid model. And so in that case, that was actually one of those decisions that sort of occurred outside of our reopening committee, because we felt very strongly that hybrid model had to have some coordination across BOA. It wouldn't make any sense for us, for Amity, to say, well, these kids come to school on Mondays and Tuesdays, and have it be totally different from what the elementary schools were thinking. So the BOA superintendents met probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, and kind of we wrangled with our own set of locks to figure out what the hybrid structure would be. But clearly the hybrid structure, first and foremost, I will say, is aligned K to 12. It is based on an alphabetical model. So we were able to we did split according to the Amity enrollment because we are the largest of those enrollments. So A to K is approximately half of our student body. L to Z is approximately the other half. So that's how the hybrid model is going to be split. We are very much aware that there are going to be some families where the students have different last names. We'll deal with that on kind of a case-by-case basis, and we'll sort of figure out how to make those mesh. But that was kind of our first big sort of push. And then we had to talk about kind of what the sort of day-to-day rotation would look like. That made the most sense from an instructional standpoint, as well as meeting some of the requirements for cleaning. So at this point, and this is, sort of settled across BOA, that the A to K group is going to come on Mondays and Thursdays. The L to Z group will be participating in person school on Tuesdays and Fridays. And there's a flex day on Wednesdays. And how we're all using those, sort of what's happening on those days is still actually under discussion. We are looking at a bunch of possible models and scenarios for what hybrid means. And it's one of those places where I have asked the state for additional information because it's really not clear what they mean when they say a hybrid learning environment. So that's one of those questions that we have outstanding. But that structure and that idea of making sure that we were aligned with BOA was pretty important to us. And so what happens within those hybrid days, like I said, we're still going to be kind of working on. And that's one of those aspects of the plan that is still, I would say in rough draft stages. So yeah.
Can I just say one thing about that though?
Yeah.
One of the things that I know the instructional operations group and the offsite pedagogy group has both talked about is one, an interest and response to the synchronous piece, whether we are hybrid or offsite, remote. And so certainly we heard that loudly and clearly, both from our local constituents as well as the state. So with that said, there's a need to be as consistent as possible when we know we're going to have to kind of be flexible going back and forth possibly between these various modalities. And so we are working toward coming up with a schedule, a letter day schedule and a school day schedule that will have that flexibility that could remain consistent. And so whatever the actual teaching piece looks like, our expectation is that student behavior about when they log on, how they get to class, what the expectations are for that class in a virtual digital platform would be established and would be consistent throughout, whether we are in school, half in school, or all out of school. And then I just also wanted to say something back to the question before about cohorts. One of the problems with the high school is the various class sizes. And so as Dr. Byers said before, not only are we looking, we are committed to maintaining at least 3 feet, possibly, preferably more in a lot of our classrooms, which we can do. And if we can't do that, then we will physically move the class to a larger space. And we do have a couple different spaces around the high school in order to do that, such as the lecture hall or the library floor or those kinds of places. So.
All right, and Mrs. Mann actually did bring up an important point that's connected to one of the questions, and one that came through was, are teachers going to be presenting lessons live? And I will say that is something that is still subject for discussion, and it is within the realms of some collective bargaining issues, as well as just really in general some privacy and data issues. But as opposed to the idea of a live lesson, the idea of synchronous learning. And again, to sort of echo Mrs. Mann, the surveys we administered at the end of the school year after our sort of three months of distance learning that was asynchronous, loud and clear from parents, from students, and from many teachers was that a synchronous schedule was far more supportive. So synchronous doesn't mean live, but it does mean that at 10:44, you are going to check into your third period class in some way, shape, or form. And something's going to happen for a chunk of time that's related to that third period class. And when it's over, you're going on to fourth period. So that is going to be an important aspect of both the hybrid as well as the remote learning plan, because that was one of the areas where we got overwhelmingly loud feedback that that was something that we needed to make adjustments and improvements to, and we are more than happy and willing to do that. So I guess the other big question that kept coming up again from several different board members was, what do we do with the students who aren't there? And I've really looked at our students who are not attending school in kind of three categories. We are going to have a subset of students who can't come to school because they're quarantined or because they're sick. And frankly, we have dealt with this since school began. We've always had kids who had the flu or who had a stomach bug, who are out for a short period of time, and then they show back up again when they're all better. And so the students who either have to quarantine or who are out ill because of COVID are going to, we don't have to wrap our heads around something new. It's what we've done with kids in the past when they have been out sick. We oftentimes provide those students with work. They oftentimes will make some appointments with teachers to get some additional help if they aren't able to accomplish some of that work. We extend deadlines. But the idea that we have to think of something new for something that's happened all the time in the past, we can kind of let that go, which is frankly, given all these new things we're thinking about, it's sort of a relief to say, okay, we have an ability to say, nope, we know how to do that. We've done it well for a while. We have a second group of students who, because of medical reasons, will be unable to come to school. We've always had kids like that too. Those are our students who go on to homebound instruction. We have a policy around that. We have very specific practices around that. We have a structure set up for that that involves our school medical advisor. And again, there is no need to change what we've done in the past for something that we have always been able to tackle and to manage. So we will follow many of those same practices and policies for those students. The one that is new is the idea that has come out that there will be parents who just decide not to send their kids back. And it's not for a medical reason, and it's just because they just don't want to send their kids back into the school. And the question has really resounded, what do we do with those students? A big reason why we're still struggling with the plan is that we had zero guidance on that until about 5:30 today. And so I haven't read the email yet, but there's apparently a 3-page email sitting in my inbox that provides guidance on what we do with the students whose parents are simply electing not to send them back to school, and what our responsibilities and obligations would be, and what that educational programming has to look like. So when I talk about, again, that this is an ongoing process, we will filter through that, we will process it and develop it and come up with a plan for those kids. But I know a lot of the questions that the board members asked were around those students, whether it was how we provide them with social emotional learning or what their education programming looks like. And we really, quite frankly, do not have that answer right now, but now at least we have some direction that we have to start heading in. And so that's going to be probably the work of some of our committees starting next week. So that part's helpful, that somebody gave us an answer now. But I do want to emphasize that that is a big piece of the puzzle that has yet to be solved. And any questions that were related to that, I'm just going to say we don't have an answer for it as of this evening. So let's see. The other question that came up, I think, in the area of teaching and learning rather frequently was one-to-one. I don't think Mr. DeRosa, he was on vacation until this evening, so I don't know that he's prepared or ready to answer these questions. But how are we going to address the one-to-one needs for 12th grade students when we're really only one-to-one for grades 7 through 11? And then how do we address the connectivity issues for all of our students? And so if Mr. DeRosa wants to join us at any point in time, if he's paying attention, he's certainly welcome to. but hi there. But we've talked a little bit about the fact that we have probably enough supplies once we go one-to-one for our students, that for a 12th grader who's in need of a device, they can requested, and we can provide it. But I don't know if there's anything additional you want to add in that respect.
Yeah, so I think the way that we had planned on approaching this was in much the same way we did when we first came out of school in the springtime. Was if a student specifically in 12th grade needed a device, we would find a device for them and do whatever we could to make sure that we had equity amongst all of our students, 7 through 12. We are going to be pushing out a new learning management system and a classroom management system called Aristotle. All the one-to-one devices will have Aristotle on it, which also includes all of the filtering devices that we need. But more importantly, it includes the classroom management tools that the teachers can use to teach in both an on-site and off-site environment. We have been able to talk to the company Aristotle and found that we have a thin client version of it that would allow us to install the software on students' home devices that would not include the filtering or the monitoring aspects of it, but just the classroom management parts of it, so that they can still engage with their classes and the teachers can still engage them in class, even if it's on their own device, without putting on the other stuff that we use on our one-to-one devices that would do filtering and some of the other red flag stuff that we use because there are devices and we're supplying them. So that's going to be a really powerful tool that we can use. There might be some explanation that's going to have to happen when we explain to kids what we're installing on their devices and why. And I can understand it if some of them wouldn't necessarily want it, but it will be made available for them. Beyond that, I think we're just going to do our absolute best using Chromebooks and additional student devices that we bought as part of our overrun to one-to-one to make sure that any student that needs a device has a device. And then the rest would be supporting them in a BYOD environment for 1 year.
So, so Mr. DeRissa brings up a point about sort of teaching students, but one of the questions that came up and something that's been in the foremost of our minds as we've gone through these committees is the need for professional development for our teachers. We have changed a lot for them. And we are requiring a lot of changes, whether it's the transition to Google Classroom as our single learning management system, whether it's putting one-to-one devices into the hands of every single one of our high school teachers who's never had one before, implementing Aristotle, which is going to be new for everybody. Plus, we have now mandated COVID training. We want to make sure we train our teachers in the SEL strategies for social emotional learning and trauma-informed classrooms. At some point along the lines, we're going to have to tell them kind of what the on-site, hybrid, and remote learning plan is going to look like and what those expectations are going to be. The State Department of Education recognized fairly quickly that PD was critical to actually make this year happen. So that's when they allowed for flexibility for students to attend school for 177 days instead of 180. Essentially buying districts 3 additional school days. That's another decision that is collaborative with BOA. So we have all agreed across the board that August 31st is going to be the first day of school for students, and all of our teachers will be participating in PD for those first 5 days from August 24th through the end of that week on that Friday. Additionally, I believe that at least 2 out of the 3 BOA districts will be having half days for the entire, that first week of school. There's sort of a twofold aspect to that. The first idea is that just integrating the kids back in, making sure that the custodial staff gets used to the routine of cleaning, making sure that everybody sort of gets used to all the routines, and face it, a lot of these kids haven't been in school since March 13th. That there would be sort of a gradual ease in, and then they are intending to use those afternoons for the additional PD that has to be provided. Amity has not yet reached a decision on that yet. We are actually, rather than saying, okay, we have this many days and how do we squish all the PD into those days, we are instead trying to say, we need this PD. How much time does it take for us to do this? So that is one of those areas where I will be following back up with the Board of Education, hopefully with a request or a suggestion that we think is going to be beneficial for our staff. But it is a tremendous amount of new lifts that we're asking people to do, on top of just basic things like, you know, hey, you got to take some furniture out of your classroom. We have to spread your desks out and completely rearrange what your teaching space looks like, so that way we can fit everybody in here. So there is a lot that has to be done in those first days and first weeks of school. We are committed to providing it to our teachers. We know that there won't be success without it, but we really don't want to. We want to make sure that it's done right, so that way our teachers are able to be able to flow between those three different models the way that we are expecting our students and our families to be able to do. So that's going to be a significant lift at the beginning of the year. And again, we're trying to be cognizant of what the elementary districts are doing and have some sort of alignment there to help support them as well. But that is still yet to be determined, but we will make sure our teachers have plenty of PD. One of the things that probably our bright shining star of what we did well in the springtime was when we were operating on our remote learning schedule in the spring, and we had students start at 9:30, but we still expected teachers to be there from that 7:30 to 9:30 chunk of time. We provided PD every single day in areas of technology, and really, you know, topics that we said, oh, this is probably something helpful, but also responding to questions that the teachers had. The PD sessions were short, usually 30 to 45 minutes. And it gave teachers a chunk of this is how you do it and plenty of time to practice. Overwhelmingly, that model was well received. It was probably the best approach and the best way to do our professional development for staff. So we are looking that if we had to go into a hybrid or a remote learning situation, a way in which we can continue to replicate that to provide ongoing PD as we transition to an offsite or hybrid environment. So that is something that we are aware of, and it was one of like the big wins that we had, was that we were able to do that. So we will look at how we are able to support and replicate that. So that brings us to kind of a hodgepodge of questions that didn't really fit nicely into any one of these categories, but that showed up enough times that I thought it was worth having some conversation and addressing. So the first question that came up was a lot about, do we have to have some negotiations with respect to our the collective bargaining agreements that we have with our existing unions? And the resounding answer is absolutely yes. So this evening, you may be asked some questions that were not answered. And in some cases, that is because we don't have answers to those, because they are going to be subject to bargaining. And that is, it's not unique to Amity. It's probably something that is going to be happening to many districts across the state. One of the things that I think, again, that we've done well, and I don't intend to point fingers at anybody by any means by doing this, but there are many districts who release plans without engaging in that conversation with their bargaining units. And then maybe we'll have to go back and revise. And we would rather not do that because we really are all in the boat together. We care about kids, and we want our teachers to be there to provide them with instruction and education. And so we are going to have to figure out a way to work through these things. So in answer to all of the questions with respect to that, yes, that is occurring, absolutely, and it is something that will have to be done. There were several questions about athletics and other activities, and so Mr. Goodwin's not here this evening, and frankly, because I can actually answer these questions, and Mrs. Mann, who sits on the CIAC board, can also probably chime in. But as of right now, the CIAC, the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference, has issued its own totally separate set of guidelines that school districts are going to be expected to follow in order for athletics to run. So we have a subcommittee of our reopening schools that actually mirrors the subcommittee recommendations from CIAC, and they are working on the plans. But it is the intent as of this evening that athletics will start on time as part of the regular season in the fall, with additional safety measures and precautions in place. And I know that Mr. Goodwin's really been working on a plan that I think is actually a little innovative, but probably one that makes a whole lot of sense to support the safety and well-being of the entire student body. But I think there are, so I think we're going in the right direction. But I also would remind the board that any decisions that are made with respect to athletics are really made under the auspices of CIAC and what they are going to be recommending. And Mrs. Mann, I don't know if there's anything you want to add from the conversations that you've had as part of some of those meetings, or if you or Dr. Tracy or Mrs. Burke want to address kind of other extracurricular activities.
Sure, I can give a quick update. I missed today's meeting because of my classes, but they, as Dr. Byers said, there's actually, it's similar to what Amity is experiencing. The CIAC Board of Control, which usually kind of has the oversight committee for all the operations, asked for some volunteers for a subcommittee to work on the restarting of athletics, and that has now grown into a committee of probably 50 or so people, and we meet every week. And the intention right now, and it's absolutely based on health trends and metrics, but the intention as of last week anyway, and I didn't hear anything differently today, is that athletics would start on time at the scheduled time. So I think that's the 17th for football and the 27th for other sports. But that, and there are various protocols that schools have to be able to follow and kind of demonstrate in terms of health and safety checks and having a plan, which are right in line with what we need from the athletic department as well. So it all kind of works out. And then, there are definitely some questions around competitions and busing and how all of those things are going to look for districts. And then as with the statewide plans, there's the equity issue, which districts can afford to have more buses versus which districts really can't. And so those are some issues which have guided the conversations a bit, including, originally the CIAC put a statement out saying that kids could begin training in the summertime because there was so much loss of physical wellness through the last couple months, and they kind of backpedaled and changed that to they cannot do full training. There's only conditioning at this point. And so our school district is not actually having any formal conditioning run through the school, but school districts are allowed to do formal training with their coaches if they have that capacity set up. So at this point, we're hoping that the trends continue and that we can still have a fall season.
And we were,
I'll speak a little bit about the extracurricular piece, and I don't know if Dr. Tracy is going to say the same thing, but
yeah, that's what I was going to jump in about. That's fine. Go ahead.
Another part of my committee, the remote and hybrid pedagogy committee, is I also have a student representative on there, and she and I are going to be coming up with kind of a template or a protocol for students and advisors to follow in order to kind of organize remotely for clubs to meet. And so it's almost going to be like a step-by-step instruction for the process that club presidents or club leaders should go through at the high school, and then also to push to the middle schools so that advisors at the middle schools can kind of follow some of the protocol on how to reach out, how do you, what's an appropriate amount of time to meet per week, what would you, or per month or whatever, how to solicit people who are interested in your club and how to push your information out. And so a couple of years ago, we actually created a club council, and that it has a web page as part of our student government. So that is going to be a huge part of our resources to continue our extracurricular activities with our students until we can get back to full-time having kids, our lively 24/7 campus.
In the middle school, we were, kind of along the lines of what Anna was talking about. We're gonna also kind of take it a step and make sure that we're still following the cohorting and making sure that students aren't mixing again, because extracurriculars mix, across grade, across team. And so we were going to try to see if we can use some of our period 8, which is our academic success time, for students to have virtual meetings, because we're not anticipating having after school activities. Kids aren't going to be staying after school and participating in these kind of things. So we're anticipating using some of that period 8 time for students to start to organize virtually, and then take it outside of school, maybe when they get home, and find ways to virtually run their clubs and extracurriculars.
So one of the other questions that came up was, I have alluded to a couple of times that we have some questions into the State Department of Education that we're still waiting for answers from before we're able to finalize our plans. There were sort of 3 big ones. The first one being the question of what were going to be the requirements around those students who selected to do the remote learning, who didn't fall into sort of the 2 categories that we kind of already can wrap our heads around. And like I mentioned this evening, like around 5:30, we finally got guidance on that. So we will be processing and digesting that information and figuring out what the best plan is going to be for them as we finalize these plans. But that was a pretty big piece because that's going to range anywhere from, based on the parent surveys, 12% to 30% of our families. So having an answer for that was pretty significant in how we move our plans forward. The second really big question that we have, which again, we still don't have an answer to, is what triggers the transition from a full in-person to a hybrid to a remote learning, and then how do you dial back, and when do you know to dial back? And again, we have absolutely at this point no guidance as to what triggers that movement. The state has indicated that they would be providing that for us, or providing some guidelines to operate under. We know we would have to be working with our health departments. We also know that those decisions may be based individually based on a town. They may be regional or they may be statewide. But beyond that, we have no sense of what triggers that. And that's a pretty big part of the plan that seems to be missing, that we're still waiting for an answer for. The last question that we still have, that again, I haven't received an answer to, is what happens when a directive from the state conflicts with a directive from our local health department? Who am I supposed to listen to? And this is kind of like one of the ongoing battles that we have all the time, because even experts right now can't agree on many things. So we are sort of trying to navigate information that we receive from several different sources. But we literally have some directives from the state that when our health department comes, they say you can't do that. And I'm sort of saying, okay, I don't know who we listen to. And so I put that question to the state, like, who is ultimately the authority who's helping us to make these decisions? Because I'm not sure who's the requirement and who is the guidance at this point in some of those areas. So in the absence of knowing that, we sometimes can't make decisions because we don't know really which document or which recommendation to follow. And so hopefully once we get answers to sort of those 3 big questions, we would be able to continue to make progress forward with our plan. And then sort of cycling back to where we started, I know one of the questions that came up was kind of, how can the board continue to remain informed about all of this stuff that's going on? That literally changes in the course of hours sometimes. And I think, our chair started the meeting with a recommendation that frankly, it has to be more frequent meetings. Our reopening schools committees have a standing meeting every Tuesday. Most of those committees are meeting anywhere from 3 to 9 hours a week, multiple times during the course of the week, as we adjust to the information that's coming to us, literally fast and furiously. And the amount of time that's been committed by the administrators and the students and the teachers to that has been pretty significant. The only way I know to keep people up to date is to just increase the number of times you hear from us, because it's just a lot of information that happens, and truthfully that changes over the course of a month. So I think when you do meet sort of once a month, what you heard 2 weeks ago probably is totally different than what we present to you 2 weeks later. But that is the recommendation that was out there. So we have kept you for almost 2 hours as we have talked at you, but hopefully have answered many of the questions that you have. We are at the stage finally, because we had to have some growing pains with our committee as we kind of wrangled with sort of all of the emotions and the feelings that we have. But we are at the point where we are starting to put the plan to paper. And as I have mentioned, we have set ourselves a target deadline of August 4th. Because we felt that that would give us enough time to adjust to the continuing information that we receive, but also by August 4th, it would be a good point for us to review. And apparently it's closer to when we would have some decisions made. I received an email at 4:12 today that said from somebody that there is going to be some flexibility for schools in reopening plans announced in the near future. So again, I think that our decision to sort of take a breath and develop something, but also to sort of wait and see what happens was a wise decision, because right now it sounds like the landscape may shift yet again before we obviously hit the start of the school year on August 31st. So with all of that said, Mr. Belfonte, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it, everyone. That was well done. That was a lot of information. I think our heads are spinning a little bit. And I kept on writing and writing. I kind of ran out of paper. So, as we spoke about when we first set up this meeting, we wanted to have all the questions sent in, which there were a lot of questions sent in. We appreciate everyone's efforts in that. Instead of, at this point, opening it up to any more questions, I would like to open it up to anyone that needs any sort of clarification on anything, or if someone's question hasn't been answered. So if we could try to limit it to that at this point, considering it's been already 2 hours, and we will be meeting every 2 weeks now. If anyone has anything to say, I would ask if you can say it now, and we can discuss that.
So I just have one question that I'd like to ask. And I certainly understand that you're waiting for lots of additional information in order to finalize the plan. Certainly there's voluminous amounts, and that's well understood. But the one concern I have, I'm just confused because the State Board of Education website says that it's a hard date for July 24th. So I was just trying to figure out how our district was not submitting a plan until August 4th.
They say that it's a hard date, but it's a plan that's not being approved by anybody. They are not reviewing it. There is no funding tied to the submission of the plan. And the intent really that the State Department said was to gather the plans to find where best practices were and to share them with other school districts. With so many questions unanswered, I think it would be irresponsible to submit a plan that is not really well thought out based on an arbitrary deadline that is not tied to anything. There is no, to my knowledge, repercussions that comes from submitting the plan after that date. And since there's three, like I said, there's three big questions that we are still waiting for answers to that are part of the plan we're supposed to submit. That part's a little bit difficult to do until we have some of those answers.
Certainly.
That's
I was just concerned about us being out of compliance. That's what I was concerned about.
There's no compliance connected to this at all.
So there's no need to like request an extension or anything like that.
No.
Okay.
There really isn't.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Okay. All right. Well, at this point, I'm going to say that we can close things down with this meeting, and we will be meeting again in 2 weeks. Dr. Byers and I will be speaking shortly after this meeting to discuss a date. In the meantime, we'll be looking towards that August 4th date to see what our plan looks like at that date with the new information coming out daily. Is there anyone that would like to give us a motion to adjourn, please?
Mr. Davis. Thank you.
We have a second. Mrs. Eichler, thank you. Appreciate it. All those in favor? Okay.
And I'm going to assume that there are no opposed.
Very good.